This was a situation City got away with mostly in the first half. But in the second half, the Reds made changes that meant that this was truly a match of two halves. So what were those tweaks from Liverpool? But at the same time, what made City so impressive tactically in that first half? Let's take a look at both, starting with City in possession and Liverpool's defensive tactics. When City were building up from deep, the Reds were usually quite aggressive with their press, led by Wirtz pushing up from the midfield, while Ekitike stayed high off the left-hand side. And in this match, Pep was tweaking things slightly. Over the course of the last couple of months, we've seen Pep change from his newfound free-form setup back to his more positional attacking shape. But this match was once again a reversion to that more free-form version of Pep, and the foundation of this was the behavior of his fullbacks. There was essentially no inversion, meaning nothing into the midfield, but also no fullback tucking into the backline, as they both pushed up high early, looking to provide the width. And with Liverpool potentially man-to-man against the centre-backs, yes, Donnarumma could be the outlet option if City were willing to play backwards. But this didn't change too much about Liverpool's pressing intent, as Wirtz could switch from pressing a centre-back to the goalkeeper instead, with Salah then tucking in onto the centre-back. And in those early exchanges, we did see these three look fairly shaky when trying to begin the play from deep. But here's where things could get interesting, because either of these men were happy to drop deep early, which made life trickier for Wirtz. If he got his press angles perfect, he could still apply pressure while keeping the deepest pivot in his cover shadow, which would be ideal for Liverpool. And City would respond by dropping a second man. But again, McAllister in these scenarios would also push high up to back up the press. The true risk emerged if City were able to work the ball to a free pivot, while Wirtz was pressing high, and this man could then advance them up the pitch, like we see here. Liverpool knew the danger of these situations, so City switching to a double pivot was often the signal for Wirtz to stay deeper, so that he and McAllister could look to stop this central progression from City. But it wasn't that simple, because the reason that Pep now uses his fullbacks in this manner is what it allows for the rest of his side, primarily the wide men who now have the scope to drift in. So where before in this orientation, Liverpool would simply have been man-to-man, two drifting wingers threatened to overload the Reds through the middle. But we can also see a key difference in how Liverpool defended. That also meant that City's attacking distribution looked like this, with most of their play coming down the left. Gakpo in that first half was able and more willing to track back, following Núñez's movements up the pitch, and this in turn freed up Kerkez to be completely man-oriented on Semenyo, following him into many unconventional positions across the pitch. Contrast this to the right-hand side, where Salah tended to be higher up, and what this meant is that Nouri would be unchallenged when he pushed up, meaning that the right-back would now be 2 versus 1 down, which could also begin to see Gravenberch begin to be drawn across. So what were the knock-on effects of this? Several. Centrally, if Liverpool were drawn across and McAllister and Wirtz were pressing higher, it created massive gaps between their lines that City could find. And this is the perfect example, as we see Gravenberch and Szoboszlai have rotated. But crucially, we see Wirtz is still high up in the press, and McAllister backs up the press onto Rodri. And Szoboszlai, who, again, has rotated with Gravenberch, is also drawn onto the remaining midfielder, O'Reilly, who has also moved towards the left. We can see that Kerkez is man-to-man with Semenyo, as Gakpo is watching Núñez, and where Salah was initially covering Nouri, he begins to drift high up. All of this means that Bernardo now has space between the lines to get on the ball and turn, completely unchallenged in a vital area. And we've just brushed by another really important aspect of that incisive City attack in that first half, which is that left-hand side overload. The 2v1 situations essentially gave City 2 routes to attack down, as when this space was cleared out, we often saw Marmoush initially pinning Szoboszlai before dropping into the central area, where he could increase that central overload and allow City to have men turning to face and potentially create. And this is because the right-back could not fully commit to pressing the winger, like Kerkez was doing, as this would leave a man free out wide. But at the same time, he couldn't commit to Nouri fully either, because this would make life too easy for Marmoush, and it might lead to further disorganization in the defense, meaning that in many ways, Liverpool got the worst of both worlds, allowing City not to just create by moving through the center of the pitch, but also to progress and then camp in the Liverpool half by playing wide. And yes, Salah could track back like we saw at times, but it took away one of Liverpool's major weapons. When City were pushing up and their midfield backed up the attack, rather than dropping the front line completely, Slot, whenever possible, opted for his front men to stay high up the pitch, which would then force the City centre-backs to stay a little bit deeper. What this now meant is if there was a counter-attack, Liverpool had effectively forced the space between City's defensive lines to grow, through the potential for these quick transitions, giving them the option to play in behind or find a man drop in between the lines. But just before we look at Liverpool in possession and those second half tweaks that almost changed everything, if you want to elevate your tactical understanding, check out Football Fundamentals through the link down below, which is my free 1-month program designed to teach you the basics of analysis. When Liverpool were in the build-up, City's press shape was interesting to say the least. Marmoush from the left was alongside Haaland, and at times they looked to sit deep on the pivots to try cut out the centre of the pitch. But more often than not, we saw them being drawn up onto the centre-backs when the opportunities presented themselves. And interestingly, initially, it was up to O'Reilly from the midfield to push up and look to apply pressure on the right-back. But having a winger tucked in and O'Reilly pushing up aggressively meant that there was a massive risk of City now being overloaded in the midfield, and we saw early warning signs, with O'Reilly getting caught high up the pitch, allowing Liverpool to potentially take advantage of that midfield overload. So City implemented one of many tweaks, getting O'Reilly, rather than immediately pressing aggressively, instead to take up a hybrid position, initially sitting on Gravenberch over here and only pushing up at the last moment, especially when Alisson looked to chip the ball into the right back. And this late movement would avoid leaving the midfield exposed too early, which we'll come back to in a moment. And unlike City, in that first half, Liverpool did see some inversion from one of their fullbacks, in Kerkez, who would tuck in to try and increase the midfield overload, and Semenyo would have to follow his man as a result, meaning that if O'Reilly was drawn out there was still the potential for that central overload. So City at times had to be more passive with their shape, dropping into a narrow 4-4-2, allowing Liverpool to initially have more room out wide. But while playing narrow meant that City had 4 in the midfield, they all tended to defend at the same depth, particularly with Bernardo pushing up aggressively, meaning that there was plenty of room that Liverpool could take advantage of between the lines by staggering their own midfield or by having a forward drop in to get on the ball, which we did see at times. But for the most part, in that first half, Liverpool were not making the most of these little advantages around the pitch. But this began to change late in the first half, but particularly in that second half. And one of the impetuses for this was Florian Wirtz, who rather than primarily staying central, began to identify that the dangerous areas were on the flanks either side. Down the Liverpool left, when Gakpo was wide, and with Semenyo defending narrow, often on the inverting Kerkez, if the German dropped in, he had the potential to get on the ball in space to make the difference. And down the right, it was when O'Reilly got caught pressing higher up the pitch, where he would then look to drift in behind the Englishman to pick up the ball. Additionally, Liverpool, perhaps now accustomed to the City press shape, were much more effective at taking advantage of O'Reilly's positioning. And rather than immediately going into the right back, making it easier for O'Reilly to time the press, the Reds would take the risk of that extra pass into the centre back, so that if O'Reilly began to step up, the now free midfielder could be found. But one of the key changes was what Liverpool were doing down the left-hand side, and we saw less and less of Kerkez tucking in, and instead the Hungarian operated like a traditional fullback. But that did not change the role of Semenyo too much, and Shirky when he came on, as they were still very much narrow to prevent the midfield overload and the play through the centre. But with Ekitike now starting left and Gakpo central, what this meant is a Liverpool winger could initially pin Núñez, while the false 9 could potentially drop in between the lines to receive between that straight City midfield. Or alternatively, they could look to play into the fullback, who was now more often unmarked out wide. And Liverpool looked much more cutting in the attacking phase in this way, particularly in that second half. A potentially massive result that keeps the title race alive, just about, and one of the best matches from a tactical perspective in recent weeks. But what did you make of the match? And drop anything else that you noted tactically down in the comments below. And you may be wondering why we've seen such a shift in Pep's tactical approach this season. This video on screen now explains that in full, so click that to dig deeper after signing up for Football Fundamentals through the link down below.